places in Europe now they have mandates, like pretty strict mandates.
Oh, they checked all of our
Yeah,
vaccine
like
cards on the way in.
no, but like even if you live in Italy, like everyone has to live like to get vaccinated. That's the
Yeah.
today. Spain too, France, so it's like pretty.
Smart.
Of course.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this very cool, very special event. My name's Paula Croxon. I run the public programs at Columbia University Zuckerman Institute. And as part of that, I get to work with our Artist in Residence program. And I'm very excited to introduce this, which is one of a whole series of events that we're going to do with our jazz artist in residence, Miguel Zenón, who's sitting right next to me here. Yeah, make some noise for Miguel. Yes, please. Miguel has actually been in residence with us for a whole year, but we're finally having him meet scientists in person, which is an incredibly exciting thing. And we'll be doing one of these every month. We're going to be alternating between performances and events like this. So today we're going to engage in a listening party. Miguel will play some records, he'll play some sax, and he'll also have a conversation with Vikram Gadagkar, who is an assistant professor of neuroscience. And he's sitting in the audience right now, but he'll come up and they'll have a conversation about musical mastery, and Vikram will give us a little bit of his wisdom from his science. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Miguel. Please give him a big hand and a welcome, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paula, and thank you all for being here. It's like Paula said, it's exciting to finally be able to connect with all of you in person and face to face. It's funny, it's like now it feels odd, but it should be like some kind of return back to normal at some point, hopefully. But again, very excited to have these events here, and I want to thank everyone here, Marjorie and Paula, for their amazing work. It's really great to be able to do this. So, the plan today is to share some music by one of my heroes and one of the greatest musicians of all time, the great Charlie Parker, saxophonist and a revolutionary musician. So, just to give you a little backstory on not on Charlie Parker, you could just look that up, but Charlie Parker and my connection to this musician. I grew up in Puerto Rico. I was trained in music from an early age. But I was trained in classical saxophone and discovered jazz around 15, 16. And when I discovered this music, I didn't really know what I was listening to, but it was really attractive to me. And the musician that really, really kind of grabbed me was Charlie Parker, not only because of, the instrument, he also plays the alto saxophone, but there was a certain, like a really amazing type of balance between a musician that was really displaying a really incredible amount of personality and just like a really incredible amount of connection with me as a listener, but at the same time, he was very gifted and very masterfully playing this instrument that I was learning, and I still am, but at that time I was 15, 16. So that kind of blew me away when I realized that everything that he was playing so incredibly and with such an amazing technique and dexterity on the instrument was improvised, and it kind of blew me away. How could someone do that just on the spot, And at that point, I kind of decided that I wanted to understand it. I wanted to get into this music and understand it, and it kind of took me into this jazz route, And I wanted to start playing this one track. This is from 1948. A track he recorded with the Machito Orchestra. So the Machito Orchestra at that time was one of the premier big bands that combined some jazz sounds with Afro-Cuban music, and this was around a time when all the big groups, the big name bands like Benny Goodman and all these bands were kind of taking a back seat to instrumental music. So kind of like dance music, instrumental dance music was taking a backseat to instrumental music that was to be listened to. But on the tail end of that, all this bands from musicians from Latin America started like kind of finding an audience in the United States, especially here in New York City. And this was one of those bands, the Machito Orchestra. And I mean, we could go into this whole story about how all this happened. There's a lot of musicians that sort of created this crossroads, like the great Dizzy Gillespie, the trumpet player, Mario Bausa, who was an arranger and composer, who kind of brought these two worlds together. But this recording is personal to me, because this is really, for me at that time, hearing this, made these two worlds sort of make sense, because the Afro-Cuban, Latin American, Caribbean world I was really familiar with, so I could understand that. And to hear this on top was kind of like, sort of like the cherry on top for me, and kind of opened the door to interest and just to this whole new world. So let's listen to Charlie Parker, Machito Orchestra playing Mangüé. Okay, cool. So, of course, it's an amazing track, and I really can't get tired of hearing that over and over again. When I listen to that, and when I listen to Charlie Parker play, and I was saying this telling you a little bit about this before, but besides being an amazing, instrumentalist and sort of like this revolutionary figure that changed the way we see the saxophone forever, one thing that's important to understand, and it's hard to take for granted, that Charlie Parker invented a language of like a musical language, basically. What we think about as jazz today is pretty much sitting on his shoulders, almost, like he kind of did it on his own in a way. A combination of a lot of different elements, and of course musicians that he liked and musicians he admired, but he kind of created this persona that became unavoidable to any musician around his time and after his time. So it's one of those figures that's just before and after when we talk about any type of music, but specifically improvised music and even more specifically jazz music. And when we hear this, it's like a perfect example of someone who could adapt to a situation that's like so alien to his surroundings. You know, he's playing with this band, very percussive, very unique. You know, kind of playing with this against the vocals and this big band. And when we listen to his other recordings, they're going to sound very different. But for me, hearing this kind of told me, okay, so this person is special. You know, is really unique. And when we talk a little later with Vikram and get a little bit into the idea of practice and achieving this amount of mastery, you know, that's something we can dig into a little more. But I want to play another track now. This is from 1945. This is a track called Coco. And even at the time when it was released, and you know, even listen to it now, it was revolutionary to any musician who was trying to get serious about this music for a few reasons. First of all, this was one of those tracks that sort of was created on top of a song that people already knew. So this is sort of like based on a old song called Cherokee that a lot of jazz musicians play now. Is from the early 40s, late 30s, early 40s. And a lot of musicians were playing this song around the time, and it became sort of like a rite of passage to be able to manage this song at a certain amount of tempo and be able to navigate the harmonic progression, et cetera, et cetera. And it still is, by the way. This is a hard song to play. So this is one of those early examples when someone like Charlie Parker and all his colleagues did similar things. And musicians do that today. When you take a platform or a palette that already exists and you build your own idea on top. You know, when we hear the melody is very angular, it's very unlike Cherokee, but when they start playing and improvising, they're improvising over the structure of this song Cherokee. And again, Charlie Parker in full display, not only as a composer, this is his composition, but also the way he is able to navigate this really complex harmonic progression with a very high degree of mastery, and at the same time, and this is something that's going to keep coming back, making everything feel easy. You know, that's kind of something that when I listen to musicians like this, it just sounds very easy, like they're almost thinking in slow motion. So let's listen to Coco from 1945. So even listen to that now, it just sounds so modern. It sounds almost like if you just think about the structure of the song, they play this little phrase. Then there's some improvisation. That's Dizzy Gillespie on the trumpet, by the way. Then Charlie Parker improvises after him, and then they play. And that's basically the piece, right? So it's almost like this angular type of structure that's supposed to kind of give way into this longer and more structured harmonic progression. I want to play another piece now. This is from 1949. So around that time, a really famous producer of the time, his name was Norman Granz, who did a lot of things, many different events, like, he did his jam sessions in Carnegie Hall and all these different things. So he decided to produce this album for Charlie Parker, where he would have Charlie Parker basically record like the most famous songs of its time. It's kind of the equivalent if I just took the most popular songs now and made an instrumental album with strings. That's kind of the equivalent of this. And they call it Charlie Parker with strings. And at the time, it was kind of a given that this was, not necessarily being done specifically for musical reasons, but it was done for, financial reasons. They were just trying to sell some records, right? But, of course, Charlie Parker being Charlie Parker turned it into one of the greatest recordings of all time because his playing on top of this sort of like really passive type of arrangements and strings, string parts, just kind of basically goes beyond the song. So he plays the song, interprets the song, then he improvises, changes keys, and at the same time just remains himself, remains in the moment. It's just masterful throughout. So this is the opening track to this album, a standard called Just Friends. So we're going to listen to Just Friends now from Bird with Strings. beautiful. So one thing that still kind of catches my ear from hearing that, and is kind of relevant to the next track we'll listen, is that even from the beginning of the track, he plays this phrase, this very Charlie Parker-esque, virtuosic type of phrase. So he starts it with this amazing phrase and then kind of goes into the theme, but when he plays the theme, he's always embellishing, right? He's never playing it straight. And as I'm sure was the intent when they made this album, it's like we want to be able to hear the songs. You really don't hear the song. The song is like a but you don't really hear that. You hear him playing around the song, always injecting his own personality, right? And again, this is related to this next track that I wanted to play now. This is a really, really well-known song, especially at the time, and it's become sort of a standard in the Great American Songbook and definitely in the jazz, from the Jazz Songbook. It's a song by George Gershwin called Embraceable You. He recorded this in 1947, and I wanted to play this for you because kind of going back to my own personal story with Bird, with Charlie Parker Bird, they call him Bird. The first time I heard this song, I didn't know the song Embraceable You. I didn't know what it sounded like. So when I heard him play this song and play, you'll hear he starts playing this phrase. I thought that was the song. And he's not playing the song at all. He's improvising over the structure of the song. The song is but what he's playing is so melodic and so sort of enwrapping to the ear that I immediately thought, okay, so that's Embraceable You, and I learned it that way until years later I realized that Embraceable You was at a totally different melody. But with this solo, something that we can listen for as well is his ability to be both virtuosic and just kind of mind-blowing on the instrument, and just a master of every turn, but at the same time very lyrical, very melodic, and sort of apropos to the circumstance. I'm playing this slow song. I want to be able to play lyrical, memorable melodies as well as things that kind of that are impressive and technically proficient. So this is Embraceable You. That was a young Miles Davis on trumpet, by the way, on that track. I wanna invite our friend Vikram Gadagkar to come up and join us now. And Vikram and I, we've had conversations about the subject of practice and how that can sort of, we have these conversations both from the perspective of music and the perspective of his research, and trying to come up with a middle ground in terms of how it applies to both. So the first thing I would ask you, we got a little bird in there.
Yeah. Hello, everybody.
So thank you, Vikram, once again, man, for joining us and taking your time to do this. So, as I said, we'd have conversations about this type of thing before. So the first thing I would ask you, from my perspective, when I hear, musicians of this stature that obviously achieve this through a really strenuous and through a lot of work, basically. There's a lot of work to get to a level of being able to achieve this type of mastery, through repetition. And there's all kinds of urban legends about Charlie Parker practicing all day and then falling asleep and waking back up and practicing more, and getting to a point where he could just kind of do whatever he wanted. But maybe, Vikram, you could give us a little perspective as this relates to your research and how you think it relates to a musician, achieving this amount of mastery on an instrument and the amount of mastery, musical mastery in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I should say amazing music. Thank you so much. This is, I think, my first in-person event since March 2020. So
wow.
It's great to be here. And so you were talking about practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing a little bit of reading up on Charlie Parker as well. And as you said, like he was supposed to have practiced 15 hours a day, every day for 3 years or whatever. And we have birds in the lab.
Mm-hmm.
They practice 15 hours a day every day as well.
There you go.
So actually we turn the lights off after 14, so they go to sleep. But if we let them, they would practice all day long.
Okay.
Right? And so that's sort of the motivation for our research, is to try to figure out how does the brain actually get better with practice, right? Like we know, like whether it's music or sports or whatever, the great masters, they practice a lot, right? But how does the brain actually improve, right? That's sort of the question that we're interested in. And we think of practice in terms of trial and error, right? So if you're, practicing your piece, you try something, and then if it sounds good, you're like, oh, I should do that again, right? And if it sounds bad, then you say, oh, maybe I should try something different, and I shouldn't do that again. So there's a trial, and then there's an error, right? And so one of the big questions that I was interested in when I came into neuroscience was, since we learn all these things through trial and error, then where is the error signal, right? So there must be some part of the brain where if you go and look, you should be able to find this error signal, right? Some part of the brain that says, hey, that was great what you did, like do that again, or that was really bad, don't do that again, right? Where is this, right, in the brain? That was what I was interested in. And we used songbirds, as you mentioned, to do this, because zebra finches, which we study, also seem to appear to learn to sing by trial and error. So a baby finch listens to the father finch. At the time, the baby cannot sing, but he remembers the father's song, and then he starts practicing, right? And over the next 3 months, he learns to make a copy of the father's song, right? And so my project was to go and find this error signal, right? So how do you do that? So the way we did that was so before I get there, so we talked about this earlier. One of the hypotheses was that dopamine can convey this error signal, right? We've all heard of dopamine. It's been popularized in the media.
It's like a reward, basically.
It's like a rewarding chemical or whatever. And often when we're practicing as well, if we get something right, you might feel a sense of reward, right? And the opposite when you get it wrong. So there was this hypothesis that dopamine might actually be conveying this error signal. So we went and recorded from these dopamine neurons in singing birds, while we fooled the birds into thinking they made a mistake, right? And so the question was, when the bird thinks it made a mistake, what do these neurons do, right? And the way we fooled them was we actually distorted certain syllables. So these birds have like different syllables, like A, B, C, D, whatever, and we can distort a particular syllable so it sounds wrong to the bird, right? And so, since this is a musical evening, I thought I should contribute the neuroscientist's music. So I'm going to sing what we did to the bird.
Okay.
So
there we go.
So the bird song has 4 syllables, A, B, C, D, for example, which sounds like chikuwa. And we take the first part of syllable A, which sounds like ch, and play it over syllable D half the time. Okay? So the bird is, hanging out, singing, and he's going chikuwa, 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 chikuwa. But what he hears is chikuwa, 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 depending on whether or not syllable D was distorted. Thank you.
You're natural, man. Natural performer.
I've practiced this a lot.
Okay.
So anyway, long story short, it turns out that these dopamine neurons were actually suppressed. So their activity was reduced whenever there was a distortion. And when the bird heard an undistorted syllable D, it actually sounded better than expected, and there was an increase in dopamine, right? So, so the idea is that when you're practicing, when you do something better than expected, dopamine in your brain goes up, and that is telling the other parts of your brain that whatever you just did in this context was great.
Was good. Yeah.
Next time, do that again, right? And if you do something that's worse than expected, then dopamine goes down, and that's telling your brain, next time you find yourself in this context, don't do what you just did because it wasn't good, right? And we don't know for sure, but we think that something like this is probably happening in humans as well.
Right.
And in fact, there are EEG studies on human musicians which have also found similar error signals. So this might be a general principle of how the brain works.
That's awesome. So, one thing that I wanted to ask you, and I know we have folks here who might be able to chip in now or later, is, this idea from a musician's standpoint, or any kind of artist, or anything that we do, and really, there's a certain amount of things that we can achieve with practice, right, and repetition. Like if we're trying to, shoot a free throw or something, so we could do that every day and just get better and better at shooting that free throw. But for some people, it might be easier to shoot that free throw already. Some people might have more of an innate type of thing. So, my question is, where do we throw that line between the amount of practice needed versus innate sort of ability to be able to do something specifically, I think about that, in the case of Charlie Parker, for example, he was obviously a musical genius, right? And maybe he would have done something else with his life, and he might have never realized this, but he found his calling and he practiced really hard, so he was able to really blow up this genius into this incredible thing. But there was already something there, obviously, that gave him the ability to do that, while maybe someone else who practiced the same amount of hours might have not been able to achieve the same amount of musical mastery. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's absolutely right. And I think we see it in all domains, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we see it in sports, we see it in other domains. They say to become an expert, you need to practice 10,000 hours or whatever.
Yeah.
But if Charlie Parker practices 10,000 hours and I practice 10,000 hours, it's not the same thing, right? So it totally depends on sort of the innate circuits, as you said. And this is sort of an open question, I think, in neuroscience. Like it's not a solved question. Like how do these circuits differ, and how do they attribute? How do you get like different kinds of skills? Like somebody might be really good at language, for example, right? But might be really bad at something else, like math. And somebody might be really good at mathematics, but not good in music or whatever. Right. So how does this work? And I don't have the answer, but I will say that in the birds, it looks like the female, right? So the males sing so that they can ultimately perform to the female. The female is actually evaluating the male song, and I think what she's doing is she's trying to figure out how well the male can sing.
I see.
But I think there are both components there, how much has he practiced, but also how good is he innately, right? Because there's a limit to how good you can become even if you practice a lot. And so I think that's what the female is looking for, is in some sense like the quality of the brain of that male.
So the combination of practice versus just natural talent.
Exactly, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you, man. So maybe we'll listen to a little more music. Stick around, because if we have questions at the end, we might both be able to chip in. I want to play something. This is sort of like a legendary composition, jazz composition from another amazing musician who you heard earlier, the great Dizzy Gillespie, who was a contemporary with Charlie Parker, and sort of like the other protagonist revolutionary time that we think of in the early 40s and mid 40s that people call bebop. This is a song of his called Night in Tunisia that was recorded by Dizzy and many other musicians around this time. This recording specifically is from 1946. And what this recording, what's really mind-blowing about this recording, on top of it being great, is this sort of break that Charlie Parker plays in the middle before he starts his solo. Is legendary for many reasons, not only instrumentally and what he's doing again technically, mastery on the instrument, etc., but the way he kind of lines up the break almost perfectly in time in this amount of space, like you could say whatever 2 measures or 4 measures for the musical folks in the house, is kind of what blew people away. And when people think about this break, this take it specifically, this version of Night in Tunisia, they say the one with the legendary Charlie Parker break. So we'll listen to A Night in Tunisia. Yes. So one another amazing thing about this track and a lot of the tracks that we've listened to actually so far is that something that jumps out at me when I hear Charlie Parker and a lot of these masterful musicians is that, you know, when you hear him playing with other musicians of their time, like on this track, you heard a few soloists other than Charlie Parker, and they just seem so far ahead. I mean, these are probably some of the greatest musicians of their time, some of the greatest musicians around. But Charlie Parker just sounds like he's like 30 years ahead of everybody else in every way, right? And there are a few exceptions when he played with Dizzy Gillespie, when he played with Bob Powell, when he played with Max Roach, who were sort of like musicians that were closer to his level and masterful musicians themselves. But in a lot of instances, you're kind of like going like, wow, he's just like really just kind of like leaving everyone in the dust, you know? And this is one of those instances. I want to play one more track before we open it up and maybe hear from you guys if you have any questions or comments. This is actually one of Charlie Parker's most famous compositions. He wrote it, I think, in the mid-40s, like 45, and played it live a bunch, but never recorded it until 1943. There's many reasons why this piece is amazing, and it was so influential during its time and still is now, sort of groundbreaking in so many ways, using the structure of the blues and adding a different harmonic progression and adding like another section, like a little bridge section. But also when we hear Charlie Parker play this piece, which is called Confirmation, it's one of those pieces where we hear his language on the composition, you know, like it's almost like you're hearing him improvise on the piece, and that's basically the song. When we hear the song, let me just play a little bit. Right, so you hear all this language, but also rhythm. Boo beep dee boo doo boo beep dee boo doo boop boop boo doo boop boop doo doo blue doo boo doo boo doo boo beep boop. So it's like he's doing all these things rhythmically that are so unlike everything that was happening at the time, that even now listening to it, it just sounds really hip and modern. So let's listen to Confirmation from 1953. great. So I wanted to maybe open it up now to see if anyone had any questions, any comments. I know there's some musicians in the house. I know Mike is here, Mark is here, and a bunch of people that might have some comments or questions about anything we heard or anything that we talked about. Anything. Yes, in the back. Just for the folks who are online, yeah. Hey.
So Vikram studies the. Do I need to look somewhere? That's them? All right. Okay, so you study how birds sing to learn to sing a specific song they have in their memory, they've memorized, and many musicians do the same. They have a specific template they're trying to match, and that can have an idea of like if they have an error of something they just performed doesn't sound well. But what about learning when you're improvising, like in jazz? Like, what's the template? You don't have a template like preconceived, or when does that notion arise? What are the error signals that might be there as a musician that you said, oh, that didn't sound good? And what do you think about the brain mechanisms for learning something that you don't have in your memory, either in humans or in other animals that perform songs but not from memory?
I'll let you maybe take that first.
Should
I take that first?
No, why don't you start with what it's like from the musician's perspective?
So I would say from the perspective of like improvisation, at least in this context, in a jazz type of context, you know, one thing that's, I mean, I think there's sort of like a general idea about improvisation, especially musical improvisation, and I mean, we can get into improvisation in general, but when we play jazz, we're not just kind of like making stuff up on the spot, obviously, right? This is like built like years of study and language and kind of learning different avenues and different possibilities for many situations, you know. So, you know, for me as a saxophone player and as an alto player, I will need to know how Charlie Parker plays and how Cannonball Adderley plays and Ornette Coleman and Joan Coltrane, all these people, and sort of assimilate that into a language that I can then use to improvise, right? That's one thing. So a lot of times, especially in contexts like this one, where you have sort of like a harmonic structure and you have a pulse and you have a tempo, you know, and you have a beat, that kind of stuff. So a lot of times when you're improvising, you're not only creating, but you're creating in context of all that, right? So if, like say, if I'm playing on a song and the song is in F major, right? And when we get to the F major, maybe I'll play an F sharp or a note that's not in F major, like outside of the key. So that, for me, that will feel like, okay, so maybe I did something wrong. So I might react to that differently than if I just played an F or an A or C or something that fits the chord, you know? Or if I'm playing and I notice that I'm getting off the beat or getting off time, or, you know, I'm playing like, you know, not in tune with everything else that's around me, that's more of that error signal to me. But in terms of like the improvisation itself, is more like you kind of building based on the surroundings, right? So let's say if I'm playing a song in A minor, I might have things that I already know that work in that key. Or if I'm playing a song in 5/4 time, or a slow song or fast song, etc. So I'm kind of building. I prepare myself with a certain amount of information so that I can react to the situation. Having said that, you know, one of the things that you're kind of not thought, but like something that you learn after playing for a while, is that there's not a lot of things that you can consider like a mistake, you know, especially when improvising. Like there's a lot of ways that you can make a mistake sound good, like something that can come across and have like something as purposeful as something that was supposed to happen, you know. And that's just something that musicians sort of learn with time, and you learn to live with like not everything is going to be perfect when you improvise, but you learn to react to situations where maybe you step in the wrong place and you okay, so let me just keep going in that direction and see what happens, you know, that kind of thing. Maybe from your side, Vikram.
Yeah, that's a great question, Andres, and that's something that I'm really interested in as well, and I think Miguel and I have talked about this in the past also. So I'll say two things. So one is that I think zebra finches are sort of on one end of the spectrum, right? So it's like they're the simplest songbird in some sense, right? They sing one song, they sing that same song all their lives, but there are other songbirds, right, that do different things. There are blackbirds and lyrebirds and nightingales. Some of them have hundreds of songs in their repertoires. They mix and match and they imitate other sounds. And so when they put on a courtship display, it's like a whole show, right? And so I think for me, sort of in terms of neuroscience, you start with the zebrafinch and you understand sort of the basic rules, the error signal and so on. But down the line, I think we can, once we have this basic information, we can begin to study more complex songbirds to figure out how they are singing these more complex songs. That's in terms of how we might get there. And I'll just say one other thing is that I feel like that, as Miguel was saying, improvisation is also, so improvisation has sort of more complex rules. And the question is, how do we get at those rules? So I think in some sense, in terms of practice, I think of it in terms of chunking. So you have sort of the basic vocabulary that you first have to learn. And then there are rules of how you can put that vocabulary together. And that might depend on context. And you might also have a little bit more freedom in how you do it. So I think with the zebrafinch, we are at sort of level 1. Learn the words, right? And then we can try to figure out what are the rules with which these words are put together. What kind of freedom do you have? Does it depend on context? Does it depend on who you're singing to? And so on. But it's a great question, yeah.
Awesome. Mark, you want to go ahead? Since you're already up here.
All right, well, this is kind of actually a follow-up question, which is, if the zebrafinch has a fixed template, or, it's like a classical musician that's only ever learned one song, right? Like the tricky bit for you is you've got to be coming up with the template in real time while also trying to match it. And I guess I'm just curious about your introspection into that process. And if the answer is I have no idea, or if the answer is it's different for everybody, like that's cool. But like, are you pre-hearing phrases or fragments of phrases such that like you're pre-hearing that template before you then try and match it? Or is it just happening sort of intuitively in real time with no sort of conscious awareness of where it's going? Or is it sometimes one and sometimes the other?
Yeah, I would say it's sort of a combination. And this is a great question because it's of course it's something that also is different for everybody and everyone deals with it differently. But I would say for example, when I was starting to kind of learn the language, a lot of the stuff that I was playing was premeditated because I would go, I know that this instance is coming up, like this chord or this downbeat or whatever. And I know that this thing that I practiced or I learned from this solo that I heard works here. So I'm going to play that. So, that's coming 2 bars from now. When I get there, I'm going to play that, right? And then as you develop more and more language, that starts happening less because you have a quicker capacity for reaction. So you don't have to plan it that far ahead, and you kind of like get to the spot and you kind of react to where you were before and where you're going after that, So I would say... one of the things that at least as a musician, myself and a lot of colleagues and people that I know, you're kind of trying to get to a point where you don't have to prepare things. Like you don't have to like play preconceived things. As a matter of fact, one of the things that a lot of musicians, and I would say myself included, would do is like when you get to a spot and you say, okay, I know this is going to work here, but because I already thought of it, I'm going to discard it, right? So in a way, it's like you're trying to be sort of more of a purist creatively and say, okay, that was something preconceived. Let me just get closer to the spot. And then whenever I'm there, then I'm just going to react when I'm there. You know what I mean? So I think it's sort of like a process. Yeah. You had a question. Yeah, if you want to come up.
In terms of mistakes, like in music, are there, like, as you said, music's kind of like a language where you learn words and learn a phrase and then put them together in a sentence. So, but in language, there are like actually different kind of mistakes. For example, there are grammar mistakes, also semantic mistakes, where you change the meaning of a word, of a sentence. So, is there similar kind of like differences in terms of mistakes? Like, are there low level or high level in music, where you can change the meaning of the music if you make a mistake, or you just change like the grammar or syntax?
Yeah, I mean, from the musical perspective, at least in terms of the music we're listening now, like for example, like there are certain things that are sort of pre-established. Like if I'm playing a melody, right? If I'm playing, something like that Charlie Parker melody that he played, which I know how it goes, and if you know the melody, you're gonna recognize it, right? And if I play a wrong note and you know the melody, you're gonna realize this, you're gonna notice it's wrong, right? But maybe from your perspective, if I'm improvising and I play something that I consider a mistake, that might not sound like that on your side, because it's like I'm the one that's kind of thinking about it from my perspective. And also, I feel like, kind of like what you were saying, there's like certain level, like different levels of mistakes, right? Like if I'm playing and I'm playing out of time, and I'm getting off the grid or getting off the groove, or I'm just playing in a different key, right? That's something that's like, it's obvious. Like all the musicians around me are gonna notice that I made a mistake, but some mistakes are gonna be more for myself. Like, I meant to play this note there, and my finger slipped and I played something else. So it might be more of a technical thing. Or, I think I thought this chord was going, and I played this one note, and it was another chord. But that might be something that I'm only gonna notice. And as a matter of fact, it's gonna happen so fast that sometimes I'm not even going to notice or care that it happened, because it might not really affect the music. It might just be kind of an after the fact. If I'm listening to the recording or something like that, I'm going like, I missed that one chord there, or like I got off the beat there, that kind of thing. But in the moment, I would say, unless it was something really, really super, like blatantly different than everything else, I don't feel like it's going to really affect the music, and it's not going to really throw me off, as an improviser.
So there are different levels of mistakes, even in
I would say there are different levels musically of mistakes. In this music, I mean, if I was playing a classical piece or something that was kind of pre-established, something written down, and it has to be the same notes every time, then that's a different level, because then you have to play, this is C sharp, you have to play that C sharp every time. If you play a C natural, then that's a mistake. But when you're playing improvised music, like I think the parameters are a little wider, like it's a little more room for error, if you will.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to think about who makes the mistake, right? So if Miguel is playing jazz and he makes a mistake, that might then become like a new genre of jazz, right? But if I'm trying to play jazz and I make the same mistake, then they'll laugh me off the stage. So it is interesting, because it's like mistakes are often how music might evolve, or language might evolve. Like lots of like things that we speak now, like the way I'm speaking now, it was probably considered a mistake at some point. So it's also interesting to think about the context in which the mistake is made, and how that can actually become something even better than saying it correctly.
Great. Thank you for your question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
How are we doing with time, Paula?
We're a little over, but I want to relay one question from the live stream as well, if I can. So somebody is asking about the difference between transcribing or copying or imitating and improvising. And they're curious to know whether or not there are different brain areas even involved in those processes. Like, how different are they? Is it that you're using one to build on for the other, or are they really separate processes?
Yeah, maybe I'll take that first. So from my perspective, I feel like in order to be able to improvise within a musical language, you need to kind of build up to that language, like I was saying before. So a lot of times transcription, which means like learning a solo, imitating a solo, or just listening to a recording over and over, or just really internalizing something or someone, so you can sort of build on that to create your own personality, right? And I feel that once you get to a point where you've built enough language, then you improvise off that language. And a lot of times, when we think about jazz musicians, what they do is they get to a spot within their progress where they're basically just trying to play like somebody else, and then trying to play like a bunch of different people at the same time, and then that kind of becomes blurred enough that it's just themselves, right? And they're not really imitating anyone anymore. They're just kind of like like it's a composite of all these different influences and things that they like, you know. Like I would say that's sort of the case. There's a difference between acquiring the language and actually getting to a point where you can just kind of use that language and improvise. And I'm sure in your case and your research is sort of the same, right?
I think that's exactly right. So I feel like I want to come back to this idea of chunking that I was talking about. And I think you also mentioned instrumental mastery versus then actually producing music, right? I think a lot of people just get stuck in trying to learn the instrument. Like when I tried to learn music, I never got past that stage because that can take forever. Or learning a new language when you're already an adult.
Yeah.
It's so hard to just get to the vocabulary that you can't, you're not there, so you cannot really start talking. So I think it's the same idea that I think we break up these tasks into different chunks, and we first need to be able to learn the smaller chunks. First, we need to be able to produce the syllables or the words. And once we can do that, then that word becomes sort of one chunk, and then you can start playing around with putting the different chunks together. And I'm sure you do that too, right? With like motifs or whatever.
Of course, yeah.
And how the brain actually does that, it's an ongoing field of research, but people think that this part of the brain called the basal ganglia are heavily involved in practice and in chunking and in selecting which actions to produce at which time.
Awesome.
Should have practiced that, but I didn't, and so I have no mastery of it. I just want to come up here and thank both of you. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Vikram. Thank you all for being here. For those of you in the building, we're going to head outside and chat and continue the conversation. For those of you joining from the live stream, thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you all.
Yay.
Awesome. Thank you, Vikram.